So today I want to go over what is easily one of the strongest endgame builds in Season 1 of Diablo 4, and this is going to be a variation of the Tornado Druid build I went over in one of my recent videos. Now the biggest difference with this variation of the build is we are using the Barber Wrathful Heart, and we'll go over that once we go over all of our hearts later in the video. Now with this build you are going to need one unique, the Tempest Roar, which is a lucky hit. Storm skills have up to a 25% to grant for Spirit, but the main reason we're using this is your base storm skills are now also werewolf skills, so we can use all of our storm skills while in werewolf form, and they all get a bunch of additional scaling. I am also using Mad Wolf's Glee, which gives you +3 ranks to all werewolf skills. This is actually +4 ranks when max. This is actually +4 ranks when the chest piece is fully upgraded, even though it doesn't show it. This is a really good chest piece for speed farming, but it is not required. And if you're doing much more difficult content, say level 100 Nightmare Dungeons, you would actually want to use a legendary chest piece instead of Mad Wolf's Glee. So only need one unique, but Mad Wolf's Glee is very good for speed farming. Also, only 6% of people that watch my videos are subscribed, so make sure to subscribe if you want to keep up with all of my Diablo 4 content. Thank you. And then next up we have our skill tree, starting with Wind Shear, which is our generator. Upgrade 1 has a chance to cause enemies to become vulnerable, and I'm using Wind Shear over Storm Strike because it is a ranged generator. It's just much easier to use when speed farming, especially before you get to level 100 and want to do harder content. But if you're doing harder content, you may want to use Storm Strike for the damage reduction. Then we're going down 5 points into Tornado, which is our main damaging ability. Upgrade 1 has a chance to spawn additional tornadoes. Upgrade 2 tornadoes can cause enemies to become vulnerable. Then 1 point into Cyclone Armor for non-physical damage reduction. And then when we activate this, it's going to knock enemies back. Then upgrade 1 causes those knockback enemies to become slowed. Upgrade 2 gives you a damage reduction every 10 seconds. Then 1 point into Bloodhowl. This is one of the main ways we're healing in this build. Upgrade 1 reduces the cooldown for every kill, so we're going to be constantly using this. Upgrade 2 gives you an attack speed increase, which also makes us want to use Bloodhowl on cooldown. And with how quickly you're able to group up enemies and kill them with this variation of the build, you're going to have Bloodhowl up almost 100% of the time. Then we're going down 1 point into Hurricane. Upgrade 1, it slows enemies. Upgrade 2, it causes enemies to deal less damage. And Hurricane is incredibly strong for proccing other effects. And because we have so much ranks put into this because of our unique chest piece, this actually does quite a lot of damage. It also helps us build up our critical strike damage from Grizzly Rage. And then we're going down and taking Grizzly Rage, one of the biggest parts of the build. It's also going to give us our biggest damage increase for the build. Upgrade 1 makes you unstoppable for 6 seconds. Upgrade 2 fortifies you for every second it's active. Then for our capstone, we're actually using Perfect Storm. And this causes storm skills that you cast grant 1 spirit, and you deal 15% increased damage to a vulnerable, immobilized, or slowed enemy. So some multiplicative damage increase and some pretty consistent spirit regeneration. And we're using this instead of Earthen Might because Earthen Might is a lucky hit effect and the Barber does not correctly proc lucky hit effects. And then next up we have our passives. 1 into Heart of the Wild to get 3 into Wild Impulses. Your core skills cost more but deal more damage. 3 into Predatory Instinct. Critical strike chance increase against close enemies. This is very good in this variation of the build as well. Then 3 into increased movement speed in werewolf form. Then 1 into Ancestral Fortitude to get 3 into Vigilance. When we use a defensive skill, we get 15% damage reduction for 6 seconds. This is very good because of how much resets we get with Bloodhowl. Then we're going down, taking 1 into Elemental Exposure. Your storm skills have a chance to make enemies vulnerable, but we're primarily getting this for 3 ranks into Endless Tempest to increase the duration of Hurricane. Hurricane procs a ton of additional effects, so we want it active as much as possible. Then 1 into Neurotoxin, slows poison enemies. This is to get Toxic Claws, so any crits with our werewolf skills, which is all of our skills, puts a poison on the enemy. We don't care about the poison damage itself, we just care that the enemies are poisoned to proc other effects. Then 3 into Envenom, you and your companions have increased critical strike damage. We have 3 of this on our necklace as well for some pretty big critical strike damage increase. Then 3 into Defiance, increased damage to elites. 3 into Circle of Life, so every time we use Tornado, it heals us for 3% of our max life. We're putting 3 into this in this variation of the build because a good chunk of our healing came from a lucky hit effect, and with the Barber you get a lot less lucky hits. Then 2 into Natural Disaster, your storm skills deal increased damage to enemies that are CC'd. Then 1 into Defensive Posture, 1 into Nature's Resolve, so we can get 3 into Unrestrained, which reduces the CC effects on you by 9%. This is tripled when you have Fortify over 50% of your maximum life, so this is going to be tripled all the time. So this is 27% CC reduction on you. This is primarily because the Unstoppable in Grizzly Rage was so heavily nerfed. Then we have our Spirit Boons. Advantageous Beasts reduce the duration of crowd controlling effects by 15%. So again, because the Unstoppable for Grizzly Rage was so heavily nerfed, we want a reduction in CC effects. Then a big change to this build is we're taking Sight Talons for critical strike chance increase, but we're also taking Avian Wraith, which gives you 30% increased critical strike damage. And because of how the Barber works, this is going to be incredibly strong because the damage proc from Barber is always a crit. So any critical strike damage increase is going to be very good. Now you can also take Scythe Talons off and use the attack speed increase instead, but either one of these are going to be pretty good. I personally just like the critical strike chance increase. Then Calamity extends the duration of our Grizzly Rage by 25%. Then Calm Before the Storm, which is a lucky hit, but nature skills have up to a 10% chance to reduce the cooldown of your ultimate by 2 seconds. Now we're still taking this with Barber because even getting one proc of Calm Before the Storm is still incredibly strong. But we're not taking something like Masochistic, which is another lucky hit, because things that you need to constantly proc as lucky hits over and over again are much worse with the Barber because you lose a lot of that consistency. But something like Calm Before the Storm would still be incredibly strong, just because only one proc is so much stronger than one proc of other lucky hits. And next up we have our Paragon Boards, and I'm currently at level 93, almost level 94, and I have 3 zones of renown completed. So just keep in mind you'll have more or less Paragon points. And I do think these boards are pretty good for where I'm at in progression, but I will be completely redoing these once I complete all the renown and get to level 100. But I think these are really good for the point I'm at. And the first thing you're going to want to take is get your exploit glyph, put it in the starter board, because you can get enough dexterity within range of a level 1 exploit glyph to get the secondary effect, which is primarily what you want, which when you damage an enemy, they become vulnerable for 3 seconds, has a cooldown of 20 seconds per enemy. This massively increases your burst because every enemy you hit instantly becomes vulnerable. Then the first board we're taking is Lust for Carnage. Critical strikes with werewolf skills restore 2 spirit. This is a massive increase to your spirit generation. And then on this board we're taking Undaunted. You're going to want to level this glyph up first. Massive damage increase while fortified and damage reduction while fortified, and you can get almost 107% increased damage using this glyph on the first board. Then we're going to go over to the right and take Heightened Malice. While there are 3 or more enemies poisoned nearby, you deal 45% increased multiplicative damage. This is one of the strongest legendary nodes in the game, and you only need a few points to be able to go down and get it. Then we're going back up. We're taking the Thunderstruck node. Storm skills deal 30% increased critical strike damage against vulnerable or immobilized enemies. Then we're going up and taking the Earth and Sky glyph. Now this will give us some increased damage to storm skills, some damage reduction from vulnerable enemies. But one of the main reasons you take glyphs like this, they give you a bonus to all magic nodes, is so you can take the dexterity or intelligence nodes within the range of these glyphs, which will give you 17 increase to that stat from 1 point, so you can get these secondary effects of rare nodes throughout your Paragon boards. And it's really strong to get this amount of secondary stats off singular points. Then we're going up, taking the Ancestral Guidance board. After spending 75 spirit, you deal 30% increased damage for 5 seconds. And then on this board, you're also getting the increased spirit on kill, and taking the rare node and 2 of these magic nodes, we get 4 spirit on kill, which is pretty big, especially with how quick we can kill enemies in this build. Then we're going up, getting some core skill damage, and we're going to be going over and taking this glyph. We're probably going to be putting the glyph that increases our damage while in werewolf within this glyph, maybe the spirit glyph, and those are both going to be good options once you get to this point. And then next up we have our uniques and legendary aspects. Like we went over, you need Tempest Roar for the build to work. We are using Mad Wolf's Glee for speed farming, but you don't need this. And if you're not using Mad Wolf's Glee but instead using a legendary chest piece, use the legendary aspect that gives you damage reduction while in werewolf form. But our most important aspect is going to be on our necklace. Grizzly Rage now shape shifts you into a dire werewolf. This gives you movement speed instead of damage reduction, but the main thing we want for this is up to 75% spirit cost reduction. Now with our other spirit generation abilities, just putting this on our necklace gives us enough spirit regeneration to infinitely spam tornadoes while in Grizzly Rage. Then for all of our other offensive aspects, they can go on your gloves, your rings, or either of your weapons, doesn't matter where they go. So in our first ring, we're now taking skills deal up to 20% increased multiplicative damage based on your primary resource when cast. When in Grizzly Rage, tornadoes cost almost nothing and will basically have infinite spirit, so this will be massive damage increases while we have all of those effects active. This actually replaced the aspect that allowed us to use Earthen Might, but we're not currently using that, so this will deal overall more damage damage than our previous tornado build. Then the duration of Grizzly Rage is increased by 5 seconds, and critical strikes in Grizzly Rage give us critical strike damage increases. You can stack up around 1000% increased critical strike damage with this, one of the biggest damage increases of the build. Then your core skills deal up to 40% increased damage based on your fortify, so another massive damage increase to our tornado. Then critical strikes with core skills increase your attack speed by up to 25% for 5 seconds. This will be procced basically 100% of the time, and tornado works very well with more attack speed. Then on our gloves, tornadoes will seek up to 3 targets. This gives tornadoes a little bit of tracking, and this is actually much more important with this version of the build because of how our hearts are going to work. Then on our legs, we have disobedience, percentage armor stacking. This is still going to be one of the best defensive aspects in the game. Then on our boots, while unstoppable in 4 seconds after, you gain increased movement speed and can freely move through enemies. So we're going to get 10 seconds of this anytime we use Grizzly Rage. You can also change this out with some other aspects, such as when you have Hurricane active, your abilities gain +2 ranks. Then next up, we have our gems, our gear stats, and our hearts. On your weapons, you want increased critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies. On your gear, you want damage reduction while fortified. And then we have our hearts. Now, the biggest change is we went to the Barber, which is an incredibly strong Wrathful Heart for the season. Now, how this works is when you critically strike an enemy, it causes the Barber effect on that enemy, and then all additional damage dealt to that enemy for a certain duration, minus 3.9 seconds, is now absorbed on that target. And then when that target would either die or at the end of the duration, it erupts all of that damage in an AoE, and all of that damage is also multiplied by 14% multiplicative scaling for every second it's active. So my roll has 3.9 seconds. So for simplicity's sake, let's say this is 4 seconds multiplied by 4 if the target survives the entire duration. So that would mean all damage you dealt to that target for the 4 seconds is now multiplied by 56%, and it blows up in an AoE. So all that single target damage you deal to a target will now blow up and deal all of that damage to all surrounding enemies, and the damage proc from the Barber is always a critical strike. So that's going to work very well with our massively increased critical strike damage from our Grizzly Rage aspect. Now, this is incredibly strong when mixed with the Druid specific heart, which you pull up to 50 distant enemies towards you while you have your ultimate skill active. So once we use our Grizzly Rage, we can pull up to 50 enemies directly to us, and this pulls enemies off screen. It pulls them from very far away, and it'll pull them all and group them all together, and that works very well with a Barber because now every single enemy is also just going to be blowing up, dealing all the damage they took as AoE, basically clumping everything and instantly blowing everything up. This makes this build ridiculously strong for anything that you're not just facing a single enemy, but also the Barber Heart makes you much stronger on single target fights because all the damage you would be dealing is now just being multiplied and then blown up as a guaranteed crit. So the Barber just makes this build stronger in every single way, except that it doesn't work correctly with lucky hits. But overall, this build is going to be much stronger than the previous version I went over. You do have to get used to all the enemies being pulled to you because we have so much movement speed in this build. When just normally moving around, it'll basically always pull the enemies behind you. So you just have to get used to when it pulls enemies together to turn around and throw tornadoes at them. It takes a little bit of getting used to. And then our last heart is just the heart. The 20% of the damage you take is instead suppressed. When you use a defensive, it blows up all that suppressed damage. The damage proc of this doesn't really matter, but it's just basically 20% damage reduction. Now, the good thing about this is that this build also uses basically the exact same gear stats as normal tornado builds. Under your gloves, you want ranks of tornado, lucky hit chance, attack speed, critical strike chance. Now, I'm still doing lucky hit chance on a lot of our gear here, even though lucky hit doesn't proc effectively with the Barber. Now, this is just because the few lucky hit effects we still have in this build, like Calm Before the Storm, we still want it to proc, even though it has a much lower chance because of the Barber to proc, we still want it to proc. So maybe optimally it would be better not to use the lucky hit, but it's still good with this build, and it's much easier when going from the last variation to still use the same gear. So lucky it's still going to be good, maybe not best in slot with the Barber, but still pretty good. Then on our legs, we want all damage reduction from distant, damage reduction from fortified, damage reduction from close, damage reduction from poisoned, but I think the best roll is still going to be damage reduction while injured. This was one of the damage reduction rolls that was not nerfed in that last big patch, so I have 42% damage reduction while injured just on the legs, and injured is 35% life or below. So once you get low health, this is a massive damage reduction, and this has saved me so many times when being CC'd. You just get chain CC'd, but once you get low, you just get massive damage reduction. And then on our boots, we want spirit cost reduction, dodge chance against distant, or just dodge chance, movement speed, and then another roll of damage reduction while injured. And just from our boots and our legs, we have over 80% damage reduction while injured. So once you get 35% or below, you get a massive increase to how tanky you are. On our weapon, we have vulnerable damage, damage to slowed, willpower, and core skill damage. I would want to change the damage reduction to slowed to probably critical strike damage. Then on our offhand, we have lucky hit, critical strike chance, and cooldown reduction. We would want to change the all stats to one of the damage reductions, so damage reduction from poisoned or damage reduction while fortified. And on our necklace, we have rank 2 envenom, which is probably going to be the best for this build, especially since our main damage is going to be guaranteed crits, spirit cost reduction, damage reduction from enemies that are poisoned, or any other damage reduction roll, and then movement speed. Then on our rings, we want critical strike chance, lucky hit chance, max life, and critical strike damage, or instead of critical strike damage, vulnerable damage is also going to be really good. And like I mentioned, lucky hit may not be best in slot, but it's still very good, and I primarily want this for Calm Before the Storm to get those cooldown reductions for our Grizzly Rage. And that's the entirety of the build. It still plays pretty similar to other Tornado builds, but I do think this build is just much stronger in basically every way, just because of having the Barber and pulling all those enemies together, instantly blowing them all up with the Barber. And then on single target fights, the Barber is also just better and massively increases our damage toward the boss. Now this build may be a little bit less consistent in having Grizzly Rage up as much, just because Calm Before the Storm is a lucky hit, so that's going to be less consistent. So you may be in Grizzly Rage a little bit less with this build, but I think the increased damage and the increased control against groups of enemies more than makes up for that. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.